go on to our program for today. Today we are pleased to have Dr. Graham Spanier discuss his just released book, In the Lion's Den. Dr. Spanier will be introduced by Katie O'Toole. The views expressed by the speaker do not necessarily reflect those of the Penn State University Retirees Association. The association strongly supports freedom of speech. To that end, today's speaker is offering his personal opinions about the events at Penn State. Other opinions exist. Civility and graciousness at this venue and during this event is an expectation. Dr. Spanier does not need to be introduced to most of us. In the event there is anyone here who is not familiar with Dr. Spanier, here's a short introduction. Graham Spanier served as president of the Pennsylvania State University from 1995 to 2011. His previous positions included Chancellor of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Oregon State University, and Vice Provost for Undergraduate Studies at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. He served as Chairman of the Association of American Universities, the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, the Big Ten Council of Presidents and Chancellors, and the NCAA Division I Board of Directors. He served on the National Postgraduate School and Naval Postgraduate School and the U.S. Naval War College, and was chair of the National Security Higher Education Advisory Board. Katie O'Toole is an associate teaching professor at Penn State's Donald P. Relacero College of Communications, where she earned her PhD in mass communications in 2010. Previously, she worked for 24 years at the Penn State Public Broadcasting, primarily as the writer and host of a nationally distributed children's current event series. Katie lives in Lamont with her husband, Gary Gray. She has 6 grown children and 9 grandchildren. She is active with the community organizations, including the Center County Historical Society and the Mid-State Literary Council. It is my pleasure to welcome Graham Spanier and Katie O'Toole.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to look out and see a lot of faces I know and realize that I should be sitting where you are. I just can't bring myself to quit. One of these days, though, I look forward to being here at one of these. Graham has asked that he be able to give a little short message to you all as probably the former employer of many of you.
Well, by way of introduction to all of you, I just want to say how thankful I am that all of you came today to hear this discussion, and many of you have already bought a copy of my book, and I will stay well into the evening to sign any other books that you would like. And it's a great honor to be interviewed by an Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist who I've known for quite a number of years. I have no idea what question she's going to throw at me because this is completely unrehearsed. But I want to say to all of you, thank you for all that you have done to for Penn State. I know most of you here, and many of you were employed at Penn State and supported the work I did when I was president of the university. And what we're going to talk about today, it's the main subject of my book is what happened at the university about a decade ago. And you know, a lot of people have focused on 4 individuals, Joe Paterno, Tim Curley, Gary Schultz, and I, who lost our jobs in the midst of all of this. But actually, this was a terrible thing that happened to Penn State University. and in the minds of 700,000 living alumni and our students, and literally dozens of other employees, not just foreigners. There were so many people who lost their jobs or were reassigned or forced to retire. It's very unfortunate, and I don't see myself so much as a victim as the entire university and all of the loyal employees and retirees who have been so connected to the university for so long. So I owe special gratitude to all of you, and thanks to you for being here today.
Thank you, Graham. And I should add, just in the interest of full disclosure, that I met Graham almost as soon as he arrived at the university in 1995. He may not remember that, but I remember. And but it was really about the late 1990s, early aughts, when we became friends, bonding over the soccer field. So we each had daughters playing on state high soccer team, and that's when we first formed a friendship. But I learned a lot about you from reading your book that I didn't know, and it was fascinating. And I am really looking forward to getting into the weeds here. So first, I'd like to give a quick refresher just for the benefit of those who may not remember the immediate details of 10 years ago or haven't yet had an opportunity to read the book. But you left the presidency just days after Jerry Sandusky was indicted on child molestation charges in 2011. And a year later, the state attorney general charged you with various crimes, including 3 felonies and a total of 8 criminal charges involving perjury, obstruction, and conspiracy to cover up child abuse. Many of those counts were later thrown out, and a jury acquitted you of all remaining charges except for a single misdemeanor count of child endangerment. And for that misdemeanor count, you went to jail last year. You served a 2-month term following 2 months of house arrest. Do I have that right? Is that all basically?
Yes, that's impressive. I hadn't counted up how many felonies they had tried to charge me with, but all of those initial charges were actually thrown out by the Pennsylvania Superior Court because they shouldn't have been brought. But then they introduced a whole new set of charges because the Attorney General and the prosecutors were absolutely determined to find me guilty of something. They tried for years. They offered me a plea bargain 5 times, as I recall, for the lowest level misdemeanor, and I said no at each time because it was not within my value system to say I was guilty of something that I wasn't guilty of. So I declined and instead elected to go to trial. The jury did throw out all but one of the charges that they compromised on in the end. That was then thrown out in federal court because of constitutional violations. That one charge was reinstituted at the very end, and that was what resulted in my going to jail for a period of time.
Well, and throughout this 10-year ordeal that you went through, you apparently were taking notes and writing and chronicling your whole experience. And I've got to say that the candor that you bring to your book is remarkable, from the openness with which you deal with the anxiety and depression that you suffered to the indignities of prison life. And I'm curious, was this painful to write? Was it cathartic? What was the experience of reliving and writing this?
Well, it was both. It was painful to write it. I never wanted to write about it at all in the first place. That's what I told myself in the beginning. But as the whole story was unfolding, I found that there were so many people who were not telling the truth. And I thought, somebody has got to tell the truth at some point. And so I started chronicling it. I have, I think, over 10,000 pages of documentation, 6 gigabytes of data from every deposition, every lawsuit. The book could have been 1,000 pages long. I stopped at 500 in print.
Thank God for your editing.
But it was also cathartic because it gave me a chance to tell the story and to get the facts down. The book was mostly written years ago, but my lawyers wouldn't let me publish it until now. You know, my lawyers are such straightforward, good people, and they kept saying, we don't want you to do or say anything that where a judge or a prosecutor might feel that you're interfering with their ability to make a judgment, because we were all convinced this would all go away, truth and justice would prevail, and it had to end at some point. So it's only now that it came out, but even as recently as a few days ago, it's interesting, I keep getting more information that I didn't even know. Just the other day, a former member of the Board of Trustees, who actually resigned from the board in protest many years ago because he didn't like what his colleagues were doing and saying, he's told me some additional news and additional stories, and some people I worked with at Penn State who were under orders not to speak with me but are now retired or have moved into other positions are quietly saying to me, let me tell you what was really going on behind the scenes or what was said in a particular meeting. So there's hardly a day goes by that I don't learn something new. But I had to close the book off at some time and get it into print and get on with the rest of my life. The other thing about this balance of it being cathartic or painful is that during the decade, I think something very important evolved in my life. I was always friends, good friends, that I felt was supernatural, but over the last decade, we have spent so many hours together, supporting each other, commiserating, telling stories, vowing that we would continue to do whatever we could to support Penn State, and we have. Sue's over here. Sue's been the first lady of Penn State for about 50 years, and in my opinion, continues to be.
So I think what I heard in there is that there's going to be a sequel.
I'm hoping somebody else will write a sequel.
Okay, I'd like to get down into the weeds of some of what's in the book, if that's okay. And I'd really like to start at the beginning, and I'm not even quite sure where that was. In 2010, a full year before the infamous presentment, Penn State's legal counsel, Cynthia Baldwin, had told you that Tim Curley and Gary Schultz and Joe Paterno had been subpoenaed to testify at a grand jury hearing in Harrisburg. So I'd like to hear from you, at what moment did you realize that your world was about to crumble, and where were you, what was it like when you had that first thought, holy heck, they're coming to get me?
I never felt, as you earlier said, I wasn't charged until a full year after Jerry Sandusky passed. I never thought until close to that time that this involved me in any way, because I knew what I knew. That there was no reason for a finger to be pointed at me, for that matter, Joe Paterno or Tim or Gary. So it wasn't until sometime after, when Cynthia Baldwin told me almost a year before that there was a grand jury investigating Jerry Sandusky, that came as a surprise to me, because I didn't know why that would be happening. I didn't have any information that there was something going on. And she had said that Tim Curley, Gary Schultz, Joe Paterno had been subpoenaed to the grand jury, not me at that point. And so I thought, well, I'm not sure what's going on, but if there's any way I can be helpful or cooperate, I'll be happy to go to the grand jury and speak with them. I mean, at that point, I was spending 20% of my time in Washington, D.C. working with the FBI, intelligence agencies. I had the lead role in national security matters for American higher education. I was a champion for law enforcement. If I could be helpful in any way, let me know. And we didn't realize until, and throughout the year, I would say to Cynthia Baldwin, well, what's happening? She said, well, nothing that pertains to Penn State. There's nothing there. She even was saying, well, there's nothing out there even that has to do with Jerry Sandusky. And so it really, to answer your question specifically, it wasn't until she came into my office a few days before the grand jury leak that I realized they were not only charging Jerry Sandusky, but also my athletic director and senior vice president. That came as a shock. Even then, it only seemed relevant to Penn State because it was Tim and Gary who were also being charged. And Sandusky had not been employed by the university for a long time. We thought that was a second mild Jerry Sandusky issue. But as it then unfolded over the next few days, and the national media poured in, and the story became sensationalized, all of a sudden, they turned it into a story about Penn State athletics, Penn State football. It wasn't about Jerry Sandusky so much as a Penn State story. And we knew then that we really had to mobilize to deal with this. The problem was, I had always been the kind of person, many of you work with me, you know this, that ran towards fires, not away from fires. We didn't hide from the news. We got out in front of it, whether it was somebody being shot on campus or any of a number of issues. But the Board of Trustees told me, we're going to manage this. We're not going to let you manage it. They ordered me to call over to athletics and cancel Joe's normal Tuesday press conference. Joe would have gotten out in front of it. He was that kind of person as well. But we were under a gag order. And once the Board of Trustees decided they were going to manage it, things fell apart. And guess what? They didn't manage it too well. And my book is very candid about all of the facts, dates, times of what happened sequentially as we went through this, and frankly, what went wrong and who were some of the actors in that story.
Are you able to sum up briefly what you would have done differently that the Board of Trustees didn't do had you been able to stay in charge?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, of course, it would have evolved depending upon how the story evolved, what we had to react to. But my first instinct was to get out in front of it. You get out in front, you call a press conference, you calm the waters, you tell them how you're going to deal with it, and then you have regular updates of what you're doing and where you are. But unfortunately, what happened is that the board said, we're not going to let you speak about this. And as they waited hours and a couple of days, the media started making up its own narrative. A lot of it was sports reporters who weren't accustomed to reporting on matters like this. And so I remember on that Tuesday morning, I had my regular meeting with what we call the Faculty Advisory Committee, leaders of the university's Faculty Senate, a group of them, and I met with them regularly. And they said to me on that Tuesday morning, you know, you have always been out in front of every crisis. We know that you would manage something like this. Why don't you do it? The faculty, the university community is waiting for you to say something. And I said, I'm sorry, I've been told I can't. And after that meeting, that was from about 8:30 to 10 that morning. At 10 o'clock, I went up to my office in 201 Old Main. I had a meeting scheduled with the then chair of the board, Steve Garvin, and John Surma, who had kind of become the de facto chair of the board. And I said, I'm stepping down as president of Penn State. It's the board's prerogative to manage this. And if you're not going to allow me to do so, that's your right. I serve at your pleasure. And so I'm going to resign. And they begged me not to on that morning. And they said to me, we have not, please don't resign, we have not been talking about you yet. The board hasn't discussed you at all. We've only been talking about Joe Paterno. And they were meeting that night, and things got worse, and the following morning I did give them a resignation letter and a very gracious statement, I thought, to the university community, which they then suppressed and would not release despite my repeated efforts to do so. Meanwhile, Joe had announced his retirement, which he had planned for at the end of the month. At the end of the season, there were just 3 games left. The board seemed to get angry that Joe had announced his retirement, which they knew was coming. They had seen the signed document that we have. I had shared it with them. They treated Joe poorly. It's one of the things that makes me the saddest in all of this, that a great human being, a humanitarian, an educator, someone who remained as the head coach until he was 85 years old, not because he needed another win on the football field, he already had the record of those, but because of what he was able to do for Penn State. I tell people that over 16 plus years, I probably saw Joe almost once a week, some periods where maybe a few weeks went by, but we're talking about hundreds of times that Joe and I were together for meetings, conversations, visiting a donor for fundraising. In all of those hundreds of times, not once do I recall having a conversation with him about football. Can you believe that? We were talking about fundraising, the university libraries, how we improve academics at the university. We would meet each year to talk about the new NCAA legislation, what our opinions were about it, but not about which would later run on Saturday, or the letters I was getting from alumni. We said, would you tell Joe next week to pass more? I ignored that stuff.
Some of the board members in those early days were irritated with you for your support, your unconditional support, you called it, for Tim Curley and Gary Schultz, which they had been charged with lying to a grand jury. Maybe commendable from the standpoint of a loyal employer who had great confidence in his employees, but could you see that as a rush to judgment on your part, that you rushed to support them?
It was a rush to judgment, but it was a rush to the right judgment. One of the first things I did after I learned that Tim and Gary were being charged was to issue a statement supporting them. By the way, that wasn't me just going off half-cocked. That statement was reviewed by the chairman of the Board of Trustees and said to me, in these words, Graham, that is exactly what I would say. He was completely supportive, and I believe he ran it by the vice chair of the board as well. The board later criticized me for doing that, and then as they changed their narrative over the following months, implied or even said that that's why I was fired. Because, well, I wasn't fired, but that's why I lost my job, because I had supported Tim Curley and Gary Schultz. But when some of you here, work very closely with me in my administration, and you know the openness we had, and you've attended my cabinet meetings, and when you work as closely as I did with Tim Curley and Gary Schultz for 16 years, every day, and you know their honesty, you know their integrity, you know that they would never lie to you. Neither of them would ever lie to me that they knew something about Jerry Sandusky that they didn't tell me, or that wasn't known. You know that I knew that what they were being accused of was not right, both from the standpoint of the knowledge that I had about the situation, but also about who these people were. And so the right thing to do was to support them. And I think, Gail Hurley, were you in the meeting I had when I brought in about 20 members of my cabinet and the people who reported these folks, and I read a statement which is in the book nearly verbatim, about the situation and why I was supporting Tim and Gary. Every person who left that meeting thanked me personally on the way out and said how glad they were that I was doing that. And in another book that's been written about this in part by Malcolm Gladwell, there's a chapter on me in this situation here, and he ends that chapter by saying, isn't this the kind of person who we would all want as our university president? The kind of person who would say what I said to my cabinet that day and about what I said about Tim and Gary. And so I don't regret that at all.
You don't regret it, but let me just push back a little bit here. This was happening in the context of people who felt the same about Jerry Sandusky. He would never lie, he has so much integrity, he's practically a saint. So they're coming to grips with that. Can you see where the board would be a little bit feeling like you had spoken too soon?
Well,
even though it may have been borne out to be what it was to be.
Yeah, well, I think that what the board said about that was an ex post facto explanation. That's what they said weeks later when they were being severely criticized for having fired Joe Turner. Now they had to start coming up with reasons why Joe was fired and why they accepted my resignation as president. And in my case, they pointed to my issuing that statement. Well, why would you fire or want to get rid of a university president who supported two people who worked with for 16 years and believed it? I don't. But yes, I can see in the larger picture how people might come to that conclusion that what should I have done in that case? Just not said a word about Tim and Gary and said, oh, well, we'll let the judicial system take care of them. I didn't say anything about Jerry Sandusky because, as I point out in the book, I only had one conversation with Jerry Sandusky in my life. I didn't know Jerry Sandusky. I mean, I knew who he was from a distance. I wasn't involved with the second mile. I was never on the board. I was never asked to be on the board. I didn't even know they had an office somewhere. I just didn't know about the second mile. And I didn't know enough about Jerry to weigh in on that, but I did know enough about Tim Curley and Jerry Shore.
You talk about hearing from sources that then Governor Tom Corbett was targeting you, that he wanted you gone as Penn State president. What was his beef with you?
Well, it's funny. This is the 17th time, no, the 18th time I'm sitting on the stage. The other 17 times were all for Ag Progress Days. And the governor and the attorney general would always come and I would introduce them and give a speech. So I knew Tom Corbett 6 or 7 times. He was here for that, and it was cordial enough. We sat right about over here and had lunch together. But then when he became a candidate for governor, there was a particular football weekend, it was about a month before the election, when I saw him. He was there at the football stadium. We were studiously neutral from a political standpoint. I never endorsed anybody. Didn't endorse Corbett or didn't endorse his opponent, Dan Honorado. We said, you're both welcome to come to football games. You can park your campaign bus out in the lot, but I don't choose sides. But they were both there on one weekend. And on the following Monday, I got 4 telephone calls, 2 from members of the Board of Trustees and 2 from my governmental affairs staff who were getting reports from other people saying that Tom Corbett had announced that he was angry with me, and if he was elected governor, he would get rid of me as president of Penn State, which is, of course, what happened. And the reason all of these people gave, and there were subsequent confirmations that he had said that, because he said it in semi-private, semi-public setting. He was in one of the suites at the stadium, and he was really angry, apparently, that he saw me on an elevator with Dan Honorado, the other gubernatorial candidate. And that was the reason that was given to me. And then, as we chronicle in the book, I didn't really, we heard from him the following week. He asked if he could come back, and he asked if we could introduce him to some donors, and he did come back for another football game, but then we didn't really hear anything until the following March. After he was elected governor, his first major decision was to create a new budget for the Commonwealth. And in that budget, he proposed the largest cut in the history of American higher education, 52.4% cut in Penn State's appropriation. Interestingly enough, that very day, I was called by the Attorney General's office to meet with them to talk about all of this, and then asked to appear before the grand jury. I don't think that was a coincidence that he was going to do that to Penn State. And after he did announce that budget cut, of course, as I did every year after the budget was announced, I would have a press conference because all the reporters wanted to know what's your reaction to the budget proposal for Penn State. And I did use the term, I did use the phrase, Abraham Lincoln is weeping now. I guess that didn't go over well with him. It was a reference to the Penn State, to the Morrill Land Grant Act signed by Abraham Lincoln, and what the governor was proposing for the future of Penn State. I couldn't be silent on that. I had to be an advocate for the university, but obviously it came back to bite me.
So he perceived you as a critic and one powerful enough to potentially hurt him.
In the week before, if I'm remembering the numbers right, in the week before he released his budget, his approval rating was 60-some%. You know how they do those polls all the time. After he announced the budget cut, it went down into the 30-some%. And he then embarked on a statewide tour denouncing Penn State and me. It's interesting. He proposed the same percentage cut for Temple and Pitt. And the chancellors, the president of Temple and the chancellor of Pitt, gave similar remarks to what I did. But somehow he honed in on Penn State, and it became all about us.
You quote in your book a PR expert who says, blame is a cultural survival mechanism. It's a waste of resources to try to enlighten an enraged population when they're in an emotional uproar. Well, there was certainly an emotional uproar, we know. And in our blame culture, it seemed that heads had to roll in order to make it right with the victims of Sandusky in some odd way. So if heads had to roll, if not yours and your associates, whose?
Yeah. Well, I have a chapter sort of early in the book called Moral Panic. And that's really what we're talking about here. I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm familiar with the phenomenon of moral panic. In fact, one of the most famous treatises on the subject was written by a now retired Penn State religious studies, I think, faculty member who has written about this phenomenon of moral panic. And so after this story emerged and Jerry Sandusky was charged, there's a moral panic that follows something like that. People get outraged, and there is virtually nothing that people get more morally outraged about than the abuse of a child, particularly the sexual abuse of a child. And so what we saw was a moral panic. It's often fueled by the mass media, and it's very hard to get the toothpaste back in the tube, regardless of what the facts are. And so there was a lot of public outrage. It was fueled by the media. The Board of Trustees brought in Louis Freeh, who was at that point in the business of making money He created a firm to do investigations. And as far as I know, every investigation he's ever done has supported the opinion of the people who are paying him to do the investigation, which in this case was the Board of Trustees. And so a few months later, he issued his report, which fueled the outrage even further. The NCAA weighed in with sanctions and penalties. Those were pretty much done away with as things went through the legal process and various lawsuits. And what got no attention, or almost no attention in all of this, is at the same time that Louis Freeh, who was being touted as the former director of the FBI, as if this was an FBI investigation, not his own private firms. At the same time that was going on, I was being reviewed for the renewal of my national security clearance. So national security clearances have been in the news a lot lately. You all know what I'm talking about now. I have top secret and what are called SCI, sensitive compartmented information clearances. And there was a 6-month review of my clearance going on by what's called the Federal Investigative Service. They did reviews for the Department of Defense that held my top secret clearance, and then within the intelligence community, higher level clearances. I was exonerated about all of this in that review. And when I insisted that before Louis Freeh issued his report, he meet with me, because he didn't want to hear what I had said. And he didn't meet with any of the other key players in this who might have had information. I offered to give him the report, a security clearance review like that. Mine was about 300 pages long, longer than the Freeh report. The only people allowed to see that are the folks who have commissioned it, Department of Defense or whomever. And I, as the individual who the report is about, has the right to get my report. And if I want to release it, I can. And I offered it to Louis Freeh to see and begged him, beg might be too strong a word, but asked him not to issue his report until he had read this review. He wouldn't see it. He didn't see it. He didn't wait. He rushed out his report.
Former Pennsylvania Governor Dick Thornburgh, who had also served as Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, was subsequently hired by the Paterno family to review the Freeh report. And his conclusions were similarly scathing. He called the Freeh findings, quote, incomplete, inaccurate, and speculative. And he said that cover-up claims were unfounded and constituted a rush to injustice. What long-term impact of Thornburgh's report do you see?
Well, you know, like so many other things in this whole saga, his report didn't get the attention it should have. Dick Thornburgh was not only the former governor of Pennsylvania, he was the former Attorney General of the United States. He was a person of incredible integrity and credentials. It wasn't just his report, it was an entire law firm he was associated with. And they did an excellent report, and it came to a totally opposite conclusion of Louis Freeh. Dick Thornburgh Memorial is going to be in a couple of weeks. Sue and I are going to Pittsburgh for that. I wish that his report had gotten more attention. I quote from some parts of it in my book, but it's worth pointing out that every review of the so-called Freeh report that has been conducted since it was issued has basically said it's wrong. People have distanced themselves from it. Members, some group of the university's Board of Trustees did a report. I have a chapter in my book called the Anti-Freeh Report. That is issued by members of the Board of Trustees who, I believe, spent 2.5 years reviewing all of Freeh's notes, source documents. They had to go to court to be allowed to see it all. And because they were trustees, the court said, yes, you are entitled to see everything. And they came to a completely different conclusion. Even now, if you go back and look at the last 10 years of history, you see gradually over time, virtually every member of the former and current Board of Trustees who's been willing to be quoted saying, we don't support the free report, we don't buy the free report. Even, I say in the, right in the beginning of the book, I have a section called Disclaimer, where I talk briefly about where did I get all this information? And I talk about having access because I was charged criminally under the rules of the judicial system. I get to see everything. It's called Brady disclosure. They have to show me everything that they have. And I have all of the depositions, I have all of the testimony at trials, I have everything. And what's fascinating to me is probably the person who was the staunchest defender of the free report is the now former general counsel of Penn State, who followed Cynthia Baldwin. Steve Dunham is his name. And his retirement, let's call it, has now been announced by the new president. And I read his deposition under oath in a lawsuit. And I believe he said 4 times in there, oh, no, we don't believe the free report, we don't accept the free report. Even after, within the university's administration and by half of the Board of Trustees, was the principal defender of it. Under oath, people sometimes tell a different story than what they're telling reporters or folks who want to hear what they have to say. I hope all of you feel just a little sense of outrage like I do about people who don't tell the truth, who aren't being honest with each other, who are covering up various things. It's not the Penn State I know or knew. It's just not the values that we tried to operate the university with during the time I had the position of president.
Why do you think it is that the reports like the Thornburg report, the anti-free report, didn't get the attention that the free report got?
I think it's pretty simple. I think it's the narrative that comes out first and that the reporters have put out there, that's what tends to stick. That's what tends to stick. And it's very hard to undo the narrative. I think, that I'm not condemning the media. I mean, as you know, Katie, my whole career, I've been a television talk show host. I started out as a reporter. I love the media and I support it and so on. But in this case, a lot of reporting is wrong, and that's what people hear first. And you try to correct the message. It's very, very hard to do once that first set of messages is out there. And if you look at national surveys of what people believe of America's institutions, they have wonderful opinions about the military, and they have wonderful opinions about higher education, and almost down at the bottom is the media. But guess what? When we turn on the news or open the newspaper, we tend to believe what we're reading. We don't think about it critically. We assume the reporters have done their job accurately, and that is what tends to stick with us.
You eventually filed a defamation lawsuit against Louis Freeh, and his response was that the report was simply opinion, basically, and not subject to defamatory action.
Yeah, at one point, we did try to go after Louis Freeh, and at one point, his main argument in court, by the way, we were 8-0, 8 games, no losses against him in various courts. His strategy at some point became, you can't sue us for defamation because everything we've said is opinion. Even though we're saying it's factually incorrect and we have the facts, it's opinion. I've learned so much about the legal system through all this. I joke that if I were still president of Penn State, I would award myself a water. But that turns out to be true, that if it's opinion, you can get away with it.
Do you feel like that's a little bit of an acknowledgement, no matter how grudging, that it was some sloppy work?
No,
I mean, the board
yeah.
of trustees didn't hire him for an opinion. They hired him for an investigation.
Well, it was a slippery legal way out of some of his argument, but even now, anytime there's like yesterday, there was a story, in the, I think it was yesterday morning in the Altoona Mirror about all of this, and they always reach out to Louis Freeh. Said, what do you think about what Spanier said? And he's still denouncing him at every opportunity. His latest argument, by the way, that he gave the Altoona Mirror yesterday was, oh no, everything I said must have been right because Senator Mitchell, who was brought in as the integrity monitor that the NCAA had assigned in the Penn State, paid a couple $1 million to, he embraced the Freeh report. Well, what he doesn't know, but that I know, is that George Mitchell did not embrace the Freeh report. He didn't say so publicly, but he said it privately to folks who said to me, he's not. And he came in and, you know, he was being paid to be the integrity monitor. It was his job to do that. But he said early on, after I think his second visit, I don't think we need to do this anymore. I don't think you need to pay me anymore because the athletic culture that has existed in Penn State historically is just fine. And all of these evil things that were being said are really not correct. That's not what he was fighting.
Well, that's interesting. And I'm wondering, because you worked in national security and came into contact with FBI Director Robert Mueller and CIA Director George Tenet, did you have any conversations with them afterwards or get any sense of what they felt about their fellow director's report?
Well, I don't want to mention people's names
Okay.
right not necessarily, but I will say that to this day, from the moment this all broke loose, and to this day, I have had lots of continuing contact with colleagues of mine who I worked with and supported, you know, at the FBI, CIA, throughout the federal government, and I'm continuing to consult with the National Security Unit. I received incredible support from my colleagues in Washington who knew this was all nonsense, what they were hearing here. But they were powerless to intervene and make a difference here in Pennsylvania. There was the assistant director of the FBI at the time drove up to State College. I was still in Schreier House. I hadn't moved out quite yet. Immediately after, came up to Schreier House, president's residence, to talk to me about this and say, you know, this is not right what's happening, and we all know you were supportive, but there's nothing they could do about it. The Pennsylvania judicial system has several things about it that are very unique, let's just put it that way. And it could use a good dose of reform, in my opinion.
What was the biggest instance of injustice that you felt along the way you're getting your law degree, you go to work yourself? What would you see as something that just has to be fixed?
Well, the way in which the system is set up to allow prosecutorial misconduct to unfold and go unpunished. Prosecutors have a tremendous amount of power and influence, and it's really unchecked. The only place it could ever be checked is in a courtroom with a judge who doesn't allow it to happen. But the judges work so closely every day with the prosecutors. They're constantly in and out of their courtrooms. It's almost impossible, it seems to me, for a judge to countermand what prosecutors are presenting. But in this case, there was a tremendous amount of prosecutorial misconduct. It started with a man named Frank Fina, who was head of the criminal division of the Attorney General's office under Tom Corbett when he was Attorney General. He continued in that role under the new appointed Attorney General to fulfill Tom Corbett's term, Linda Kelly, and he was allowed to do things that I was on a nationwide podcast yesterday where someone was giving a summary. It says the most egregious violation of prosecutorial rules. Now, he was later suspended from the practice of law by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court for what he did to me, for his wrongdoing in the case. And Penn State's general counsel, who he was in collusion with to, let's say, allow falsehoods to be stated in front of a new grand jury 3 days before the election of a new Attorney General, she, Cynthia Baldwin, was censured by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And the grand jury judge who allowed all of this to occur and go forward was forced out by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court for his wrongdoing in what he did to me. It's amazing that all of these people, were censured, suspended, or lost their jobs, but I'm the one who had to go to jail.
Actually, it really is striking in reading your book to see the large number of people who were associated and part of bringing you down, who eventually also went to jail or had other sanctions against them. And you devote a chapter to Horngate and the people who were involved there. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. My book was getting to be a little too long, and so editors were saying, cut things out. Maybe we can just cut out that chapter on Horngate. And I thought, no, it's just way too interesting and way too related. The chapter's called Horngate and the Keystone Cops. And so it turns out that virtually everybody who ended up being involved in coming after me, prosecuting me, charging me, serving as judges at various levels, including two of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court justices, were all caught up in this pornography scandal being run out of the Attorney General's office by this person I just mentioned, Frank Fina, and we're not talking, this chapter of mine isn't to say, okay, folks, pornography's bad, don't do it. It's not a moral thing I'm talking about in the book. It's the idea that out of the Attorney General's office on state computers, people who are involved in all of this are exchanging not just a few videos or a few images, tens of thousands on a regular, long-term, ongoing basis. And there is something in the judicial system known as ex parte communications. Judges and prosecutors are not supposed to be communicating with each other. I don't even know if they're allowed to play golf together, but there was so much interaction back and forth from all of these people involved. It had to be, it was revealed, it was a bit of a scandal within Pennsylvania, not so much news outside of Pennsylvania, but so many of the people that were intimately involved. One person who lost his job was head of the State College Attorney General's office. He lost his position. He was involved in Horngate. I have in my book how many things he sent as a part of this or received. And so he was moved out of that position. And guess what? They turned to him yesterday, the Altoona Mirror does, to get a quote from him about whether I'm okay. Oh, no, he's a terrible, guilty person. He's been retired, he was run out of office. They're turning to him for advice on what the public should know about me. It's crazy.
Well, since you mentioned the Altoona Mirror a few times, there was a whole chapter devoted to media in your book, Media Culpa.
Yeah.
In the chapter, very, very clever. And you especially take issue with reporting based on leaked information from legal and governmental sources. Yet some of journalism's greatest contributions to the public good have been based on leaks that they get. I'm thinking Watergate, Pentagon Papers, for example. So I'm wondering, you're a former member of the media yourself, as you said in your book. How would you suggest we balance those Sixth Amendment rights of a criminal defendant or a grand jury witness against the First Amendment rights of a free press?
Probably my closest personal friend in life is the most decorated investigative reporter ever. He must be approaching 100 Peabody, Emmy, Polk awards. And he was the chief investigative correspondent for ABC News for many, many years. And we talk about this. And he said to me that many of the most important investigative news stories of our time were his stories. And he said, well, yeah, I get information from sources, even from grand jury leaks. That's how reporters like to get our information. But there's a difference between somebody sharing information that you then carefully check out and research, and what happened in this whole saga, where you have one reporter in particular who was very closely connected, that's all I want to say, to the lead prosecutor, and was being fed leaks and then reporting them uncritically. When you use a reporter as a tool for trying to get to pollute a jury pool or to stir up moral panic, it's one thing for the reporter to get that information and pursue it as a story, but you usually need a second source. You must challenge the motives of the leaker. Why am I being told this? Am I being used? Is it accurate? Should I run with it? Will my editors stand behind it and feel that it's the right kind of story? So I'm not opposed to good investigative journalism, but what bothers me about so much of what happened is that, I talk about it in the book, and you see it all in the news every night. I mean, you can't turn on a news show, whether it's CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, right? There's always going to be a banner at the bottom, exclusive, breaking news, as we go on the air, first to report. And it is just such a constant thing. I mean, you can turn on the news at 6 at night, and it's a story I heard at 8 that morning, but it's now breaking news. Well, hey, don't they know it broke hours before or the day before? So I think we had that problem with this. We had a lot of reporters who were scurrying to be the ones to get something out there, and they might even just hear a rumor and run with it as a story. And that's a little bit what I talk about in that chapter.
You also note in the book that if you had to do it again, you would take the witness stand.
Yeah.
What difference do you think that might have made?
You know, for all those years, first of all my lawyers said from the beginning, I'll tell you what my first lawyer said to me, who was representing me from the Schneider Law Firm in Philadelphia. She said, Graham, you know, she had been a prosecutor and a defense attorney, she was the head of the white collar division of this major Philadelphia law firm. She said, I've had a lot of clients over the years. She's had hundreds of cases. She said, you know, everybody I've represented is at least a little guilty of something. She said, you're the first client I've ever had, actually is not guilty. And all my lawyers are telling me, this is never going to go anywhere. It's never going to go to trial. There are too many things wrong with it, and there's no evidence. And, you know, I was saying, well, if it ever does, put me on the witness stand. I think I'll be credible. I'll tell the truth. And so there was always the plan to put me on the witness stand if it ever went to trial. So in 2017, sure enough, it goes to trial, and I'm going to be on the witness stand. Finally, get up there. And the prosecutors presented 15 witnesses. 13 of them had nothing to do with me. It was like they were prosecuting Sandusky, not me. The only two people who had any contact with me at all, or had ever spoken to me about anything relevant, were Tim Curley and Gary Schultz. And they were presented as the last two prosecution witnesses. They were required to testify. And they got on the witness stand and told the truth. They said, we never told Ray Spanier anything about sexual abuse because we were never told anything about that. The prosecutor went nuts. The judge ended up supporting the prosecutor. They punished Tim and Gary. Between them, they served a year in jail and house arrest for telling the truth at my trial, which was unbelievable. But then I was going to be the witness the next day, finally. And my lawyers that night said, we've reviewed all the transcripts, everything. There isn't a shred of evidence that was presented about you or about any wrongdoing on your part over the last, this was now 3 days or so of testimony. So there's no need for you to testify. And we send a powerful statement by saying there's no need for him to testify because no evidence has been presented. So I didn't testify. I still wanted to, and I called every lawyer that had been involved along the way. And then I asked my wife, and they said, no, don't do it, don't do it. That was a 6-0 vote. And I said, okay, I won't testify. But now I wish I did. It's the one regret I have, because what's the worst thing that could have happened? I don't know. I would have been found guilty of this misdemeanor or something. To understand the decision not to testify, you would have had to have been in the courtroom and see the antics, the shenanigans of the prosecutor who had taken over the case at that time. Laura Ditka was her name. You'd never seen anything like that in a movie, unless it was a movie where they were trying to make fun of a courtroom. It was a pretty bizarre scene. I describe it a little bit in my book, what that scene was like. My first draft of describing it, my wife made me cut some of it out because I was characterizing a woman and she didn't want me to be perceived as saying certain things about the characteristics of that woman, so I backed off on that. But you'll get the message if you read it, because I do say there that this prosecutor was the niece of Mike Ditka, former well-known football player. And I think I did say in there that she resembled Mike Ditka in his playing days. That's as far as I went with that character. But it was a pretty bizarre scene. And I think my lawyers were concerned about what her antics might be, even if I took the witness.
Earlier in your book, in the very opening chapters, you talk about your childhood and growing up with a father who was physically abusive. And you also note that he had a tough childhood, fleeing Nazi Germany as a child to escape the Holocaust. But you also say that you came to understand, if not excuse, his violence. And I'm wondering if you feel similarly about any of the people who you believe treated you unjustly. Could you ever come to understand, if not excuse, a Mark Emmert or a Cynthia Baldwin or a John Surma or a Frank Fina?
Yeah. Well, I never excused my father for the abuse I suffered as a child. But I came to understand it because he had to leave. He had his he was snuck out of Nazi Germany at age 15. He went to South Africa. I met my mother. I was born there. I'm an immigrant. And it was never right what he did. But as I say, I came to understand it. I think the bad actors who pursued me and you know, besmirched my reputation and did what they did to Joe and Tim and Gary and dozens of others within the university who lost their jobs and moved around. No, I don't think I can ever quite forgive them. One of the people called me up after 3 or 4 years to apologize for throwing me under the bus. And I've had a few members of the Board of Trustees who were board members at that time say to me, you know, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. And they're now claiming they were railroaded into their decisions by John Surma, who kind of took over as chair of the board. And you know, some of them have been turned on by various people, so now all of a sudden they're commiserating with me. And so no, I don't think I can really ever forgive them or excuse them or think to myself, oh yeah, they just did what they had to do because of the situation they're in, because they should have been brave enough. I mean, if you're a trustee of a university, if you're a vice president or an officer of the university, you should be brave enough to have the courage of your convictions and to stand up and do the right thing. I mean, I was willing to do it in my last days as president. At some point you realize you could lose your job, but you have to do the right thing. And so I don't think I can forget it. I mean, one of the most upsetting things of all of this was that the prosecutors had been told that I was a family sociologist, I was a marriage and family therapist, I was a child abuse victim, and I was the last person on earth who would ever ignore child sexual abuse. And I am the last person who would ever ignore that. And they were so desperate to find something I was saying that I was lying about that they sent Attorney General investigators and state police to Chicago to track down my family at your taxpayer expense to find out if I was lying about being abused as a child. They show up at the door of my brother with their notes wanting to talk to him about this. And then they're on their way to see my mother, who at the time was in her 90s and in a nursing home. And I got wind when my brother calls and says, you won't believe this. These guys are from Pennsylvania showing up with their badges, and they're on their way to see mom. And I called my attorney right away, and she called Bruce Beamer, who was then in charge of all of this for the Attorney General, and said, if you go talk to Spanier's mother, I will come down on you like a ton of bricks. She is ill, she's in a nursing home, you'll kill her. They did. My attorney stopped them from going to see her, but she heard they were on their way, and she had a heart attack. You couldn't make all this stuff up. And you know, I had offered to show my medical records of the 4 operations to reconstruct me internally from the childhood injuries I had from my father. I said, show them the medical record. Why do you have to go to Chicago and pester my family about this stuff? Because they were desperate to find anything, something they could use.
Well, this has certainly, as you bring out, had a tremendous impact on you, on our community, on the university, and nationally. There's probably been implications nationally. And just this week, U.S. News News ranked Penn State as the Big Ten's worst valued school, which makes me wonder if you are still feeling the ripple effects of this. We'll be wrapping up here pretty soon, but I'm wondering what advice you would give to Neely Katie. Have you given her any advice?
I've met her. I have to tell you, I think she's going to be a spectacularly phenomenal president for Penn State. I think she's going to be one of the great Penn State presidents. I think our new athletic director will be as well. I have not met him yet. And I hope I will be getting together with her, but I'm not going to give her any advice unless she asks for my advice. And because if you're a former president, you shouldn't be telling your successors what to do. But I will tell you in all candor that I think a lot of things that have occurred at Penn State in its operation, its management, in its messaging, since I stepped down as president, have been disappointing to me. I think that the culture seems to have changed in certain ways, and I haven't inside been support. I don't issue public statements about it, but there's some things that I just not sure were handled right. I have tremendous optimism, however, going forward with the new administration, and I believe 6 of the vice presidencies in the university have already been changed or about to be changed, and so I'm feeling pretty good, and I'm still in a mode, despite what's happened, of doing everything I possibly can to support Penn State and to promote its future. I've said, you can take me out of the university, but you can't take the university out of me. I mean, I started as a faculty member in 1973. I've had so many years here. My son was born in the local hospital. My kids grew up here and went to school here. And I lived in the president's residence for 16 years, and I have all my friends here. And I want the university to be great. I will do everything I can to make it great. I'm still actively involved in every way I can in helping the university to raise money philanthropically. Those deans and others in the university who reach out to me for advice and mentoring, I am there, all in for that. And others, I suppose, have kept their distance. But I really still believe in Penn State and its future. And it's, as I said early on, one of the things that Sue and I talk about a lot, because I know she feels the same way. And you have to put that in the context of what happened to her. And yet she is still in there, always doing the right thing.
I know you've talked about the great support you found in the community, but there were many who wondered why you stayed here, and even just the fact that we have to have a reminder to keep it civil today is an indication that you still have plenty of detractors too. And I'm wondering how that makes you feel. Is it just a matter of you just want to tell them, read the book?
Well, fortunately, I don't have a lot of contact with the detractors. I know they're out there, and I see hints in various ways of the radioactivity. I've had certain organizations in town just, thanks for your offer, but no thanks. That kind of thing. But, this is where I've lived most of my life. This is where my kids grew up. My wife is an English professor, and she's still very active. And, fortunately, I don't hear from the detractors, but I hear by the hundreds, by the thousands of people who are very supportive, and that's been the silver lining of all of this, is just how wonderfully supportive so many people have been. And I feel very welcome. And you know, in the first month after this happened, I didn't even want to go out of the house. I mean, it was like having PTSD. And then when I started to go out, it was the best thing ever. You go to the grocery store, it was like a receiving line. People you don't even know are hugging you and crying. And I thought, wow, I could go get milk more often at the grocery store. This is the good stuff.
Well, I will speak just personally about your book. I found so many parts of it fascinating, and even parts, I would like to see you write a memoir that has nothing to do with the Sandusky scandal, about your presidency and your life. And just to throw out a couple of little anecdotes, you'll have to read about his family connection to Nelson Mandela. And just little things like the fact that Altoona wanted to have its own football team. There's just so much in there that I feel like there are a few more books left in you. So.
Yeah, well, maybe.
Well, thank you very much. And I think now at this point we're going to open it up for some questions and answers from the audience.
Anybody in the audience who has a question?
And I think what's going to happen is like Cliff is going to take that side of the room, and I'll take this side of the room. I guess no, you're going to take this side of the room. I'll take this side of the room. We'll have a microphone for you.
First of all, thank you for writing the book. I did read it before coming here, and it is very deep, at times very painful, but I recommend it to anybody. And so thank you very much. The second thing is, my real question that's been going through my mind is, why do you call it the Penn State scandal? We have been trying to avoid that term. You know, I was talking to development yesterday, they said it should be called the Sandusky matter. So why did you put that on the cover?
Well, that's what the editor wanted to call it. Yeah, Penn State scandal, because that's how people think of it, I guess. And I don't like that concept. As I said, this shouldn't have been a Penn State scandal, but it evolved that way. So that's why we wanted to just kind of tackle that head on.
It's unusual to see you out of robes. I saw you in robes at graduation ceremony for years and years. For over a decade, you've had significant involvement in the Sandusky affair. And given all the information that you have, both through personal knowledge and through the investigations over the years, your involvement, do you believe that the judgment against Sandusky was justified?
I get asked that often, and what I say is that I'm really not in a position to pass judgment on that. I've been so focused on my own situation, and I don't know Sandusky other than, you know, we met once, I think it was about 1998, and it was in conjunction with the then chancellor of the Altoona campus wanting to start a football program and wanting Jerry Sandusky to be the head coach. That's how that came up, and, you know, as a courtesy, I met with him to talk about it. But in any discussions about football, I would have my discussions with Joe Paterno, not any of his assistant coaches. So I was not at the Sandusky trial. Nobody who claimed to be a victim ever contacted me, spoke to me, to this day, no one. So, you know, I don't really want, from a distance, you know, I realize that it took them 6 or 7 years to get to the point of bringing me to a trial, but it took them only 6 or 7 months for Sandusky to be rushed into a trial. And it seems that there was a lot wrong with that whole process. But it's really not for me to talk about his guilt or innocence. And that's why right at the beginning of the book I say, this is not a book about Jerry Sandusky or his guilt or innocence.
Thank you.
Yeah, several of us felt that the NCAA had no business getting involved. Did not really have anything to do with recruitment, retention of the football program. And then it was a way for the NCAA to kind of clamp down on Penn State, which had a very really great reputation. Joe Sherman's reputation was so good. And I was so amazed with the way that they thought they could kind of, clamp down on Penn State and ruin their reputation.
I didn't actually pick up most of that, but you're asking about the NCAA sanctions against Penn State and how it, well, I'll say this, the NCAA was completely out of line in coming after Penn State as they did. And in the book, I have a chapter called The NCAA and the Big Ten. And in there, I reveal the backstory of what was probably going on and what, from my knowledge base, what went on. And I can speak somewhat knowledgeably about the NCAA because I think I was the longest serving member of the NCAA board. I was the first university president in the modern era to serve a full term, 3-year term as chair of the board. The NCAA, Mark Emmert and Ed Ray, the chair of the executive committee, went way overboard in terms of what they were permitted to do. Because what happened here was not a violation of an NCAA rule. Even if you believe the worst case scenario about all this, that Jerry Sandusky went out and did certain things, that's a criminal thing involving a former employee. It has nothing to do with athletics at Penn State or breaking an NCAA rule. So they used that to threaten the death penalty. And the interim president at the time, Rod Erickson, they, as has come out in depositions and testimonies, they were, what's the right word? They were fooling him. They were bluffing. That's the word that was used. They were bluffing Penn State that they were going to impose the death penalty and ruin athletics at Penn State forever. Now, under that kind of a threat, yeah, you might agree to all sorts of things. But they really didn't have the right to do it. And as this worked its way, lawsuits worked its way through courts, they had to undo those penalties because it was wrong. And then after what happened at Penn State, and I talk about this, I have a summary of it in the book, you had actual incidents. There was no cover-up by we who ran Penn State, but you had actual incidents at Syracuse, Michigan, Michigan State, Columbia, USC, UCLA, Baylor, North Carolina, of documented incidents of wrongdoing that were, by any imagination, more egregious than anything ever alleged at Penn State. The NCAA took no action on any of those. Nothing happened. Nothing at all. So, unfortunately, how the NCAA handled that was wrong. Some of it was undone, but since then the NCAA has been on a downward trajectory. And the NCAA is in a serious decline right now. Mark Emmert will not be president of the NCAA going forward. The influence, the power, and the money in intercollegiate athletics has shifted to the conferences, mostly the Big Ten and the SEC. And I worry about the future of the NCAA. And this was sort of what happened to us in some ways was the beginning of the end of the real influence of the NCAA. And I hate to see that because I was a part of building the NCAA to what it had become in 2011. And in the book, I actually reproduce the emails that I exchanged with Mark Emmert and Ed Ray the night before they did this to Penn State. And in the reply back, oh, Graham, don't worry about it. We know you, we know Penn State, you're a person of great integrity. We're not going to say anything about you in our press conference tomorrow, which of course they did.
Your narrative is very compelling, but the last question stole all my thunder, I think. But I would like to ask you a narrow question. Why didn't the Big Ten come to Penn State's defense? Could they not see the possibility of NCAA continuing to go a step?
It turns out the Big Ten was in cahoots with the NCAA. And that's why in that chapter I call it the NCAA the Big Ten. The Big Ten's general counsel, Barrett was his name, who I worked with for years in my leadership role in the Big Ten, and the conference commissioner, they jumped on that same bandwagon with the NCAA. And why, he's never explained to me, but the conference commissioner, while he was supportive of Penn State, and I was the main person involved with him, he and I together created a television network, the Big Ten Network, which has turned out to be very, very successful. He had a problem with Joe, I think. Hope Sue, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but he took Joe's name off of the championship trophy that very afternoon that I stepped down. And when he called me a few years later to apologize for having thrown me under the bus, he didn't apologize about what he did to Joe, which really bothered me, because we were all thrown under. What'd you say, Sue?
Joe saw through.
Yeah. Well, Joe he was the leader of athletics in the Big Ten in many ways, and if he didn't like something going on in the Big Ten, he would say so, and that probably bothered the commissioner. Yeah, the Big Ten actually, and I have it in the book, they censured the four of us at Penn State. And what was so interesting about that is the Big Ten presidents censured us, but within a few days, I got calls from half of the Big Ten presidents. Graham, you're great, we support you. It's like they didn't even know that statement had been issued, or if it had, they didn't support it. Again, it was just a case of a lot of people jumping on the bandwagon, and the Big Ten did as well, which is very unfortunate. And behind the scenes, there was stuff going on around then also after the Free Report came out, because they thought they were going to bring Penn State football to its knees. They were going to let all the players leave us and transfer somewhere, without any penalty. They could be eligible. There was a lot of stuff going. Why do you think the Free Report they told me would come out in the fall, all of a sudden was moved up to early July? What was the rush all of a sudden? I speculate about the different reasons in the book.
I think we have time for one more question.
Perhaps to hear your continuing story and the length of it, and it's not hard to conceive of how all of this could have somehow worn you down, cut you to the bone, caused you physical as well as emotional repercussions. It's for those who might be here, and for those who would find themselves in a similar situation, not that it would ever compare to what you've been through, but physically debilitating, emotionally challenging. Were you able to come up with anything good that you learned that was somehow an enhancement of the person that you once were prior to going through all of this?
That sounds like a question from a clinical psychologist, which Dennis is, having had about our counseling and psychological services for so many years. Yeah, I've thought about that a lot. As I said, the most important thing that can happen is having the support of your family and friends. And fortunately, I have a lot of friends, and so you've got to have that to get through something like this. You know, when I was in jail, I was around a lot of people who talked about suicide. I say in the book, the last chapter of the book is called Incarceration, and I said I was asked 5 times in my intake that went over about 2.5 hours, are you suicidal, are you suicidal, are you suicidal? And, you know, I said no, because I was never suicidal. But going through something like this, and being locked up, and being in solitary confinement for days on end, you can begin to understand why some people are suicidal. You can begin to understand that. And, you know, the way I got through it was because of the support I received. And, you know, you can't run a university with 100,000 students and 24 campuses and 25,000 acres of land, thousands of which are within, you know, right around here. Every day somebody does something stupid. You know, you're issuing 48,000 paychecks. I mean, literally. I mean, by the way, so Louis Freeh's comment that Paterno, Spanier, Curley, and Schultz hid this abuse because we were afraid of bad publicity. Are you kidding? Who got more bad publicity than Joe and me? Unless he won the game, then it was okay. So you know, I had a pretty high threshold myself of coping with things generally, but I'll tell you, some of the lowest moments of my life were as this was going on. I say in the book very candidly that even though I was a trained therapist and I knew what PTSD was, I didn't realize until months later that I had it, that I had been through that. And so, yeah, you learn lessons about coping. I mean, family, friends, the community, and you know, I think I've evolved to the point where I'm not bitter, I'm not angry. I just want to build on this experience to do good things for the organizations I'm helping to raise money for, organizations that, you know, advancing the university, wherever it might be. You gain strength and coping ability by channeling the bad stuff that's happened into good things that you can now do and that you might do for the future.
We have 2 more questions. They were cute.
Do you have any insights as to why the second mile got so much less scrutiny than Penn State did?
Oh yes, I do. I'd say 2 reasons. One is that Penn State had deeper pockets. Penn State thought it was insured for everything. Well, I happened to sign off on insurance policies along the way. Yeah, we were insured up to a degree, but not to the degree that the Board of Trustees and the administration and the General Counsel thought at the time. So Penn State and the PMA, the principal insurer, the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association Insurance Company, ended up in a lawsuit and had to settle it. The details of that were never disclosed. I gave a deposition in that lawsuit like I did. I said, I'm not taking the 5th Amendment ever on anything. I testified in every lawsuit, gave every deposition. So the deeper pockets. And secondly, what I do talk about in the book is how Governor Corbett and some of his principal campaign supporters happened to be on the board of the Second Mile. And the day after my resignation was accepted and Joe was fired was to be a major fundraising event in State College for Governor Corbett for his next campaign by the chair of the board of the Second Mile at the time and one of his other supporters. And while this was all going on, while the Attorney General and the Governor were going after Jerry Sandusky, they made a $3 million allocation to the second mile. That's where that's not only the charity Jerry founded, they employed him. He had nothing to do with Penn State at that point. When that became public through some investigative reporting, they pulled the money back. Oh, no, we're not giving them that money. So I think there's two sets of reasons at the same time why that was the case.
Katie Grant, thank you. And, I want to thank all of you because years before we had the scandal, SMU got the death penalty. To this day, SMU has not survived, has not risen above what happened to them. And my firm belief is, if Penn State had not been as strong as it was, and if the athletic department had not been as strong as it was, and if we did not have the unbelievable Penn State fan base, I think that is what has saved us from being lost in a whole trouble. And so I thank all of you who are all part of it, but I think because we were who we were is why we all survived. So thank you.
Let's all give Lady Graham another big hand. I'd like to remind you that our next event is the annual November benefits meeting, which will be, again, a webinar at home. So we're hoping all of you will attend that. Thank you all for coming. If there are any young, strong volunteers in the group, we do have to put all these tables and chairs away over here so we can use any help that is available. Again, thank you for coming.
Okay, and just be reminded that there are books still available. If anybody's interested in purchasing a book and having Graham sign the book, feel free. Graham's going to sit over there and be willing to sign books and just do it for sale.